I would stop short of saying that China can substitute USAID. China also has pretty much always used foreign aid as a geopolitical tool. That doesn't make China very unique. That's pretty much true for all donors and lenders. That if you want to understand China's cooperation in the global south, you have to understand what's going on internally.
Welcome to the European Guanxi podcast. Today I'm here with Dr. Austin Strange, who is an associate professor at the Department of Politics at the University of Hong Kong. And today we're going to talk about Chinese foreign aid. And first of all, thank you for coming on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Today we're going to talk about whether the end of USAID, what that's going to do to the development landscape and also to the role of China in international aid. So let's start maybe with what sort of sparked your interest in Chinese aid? How did you come to research about it?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It was a combination of events, I would say, a mix of my own intellectual interests and some chance events that happened. I grew up in the U.S. I was at university in the U.S., and I went to William & Mary, which just by chance is home to Aid Data, which is, the way I would describe it is it's basically the world's largest source of information on foreign aid and development finance from all kinds of bilateral and multilateral providers. And when I was in college, and this will show you how old I am, but the Aid Data was very interested in tracking, aid and capital from emerging donors, certainly including China. And China was elusive because there were a lot of narratives that were swirling about, what China was doing in places like Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, whether China was a rogue donor that was only, building stadiums and building infrastructure for its own selfish reasons and not in ways that helped other countries. So there were a lot of rumors that were swirling. There was not a lot of evidence. And so Aid Data was very interested in this. And by chance, I had been a research assistant for one of the principal investigators. I went to Beijing and I studied Chinese for a couple of years. I got very interested in China and Chinese politics. And when I returned, we had a series of conversations that led to this idea that began as an independent study project when I was an undergraduate to track Chinese aid and lending in the global south using open sources. So there's no official government data that was available to go and analyze. So we thought we could build our own data set. And that was the first research project I ever did. And that's how it got started. I think it's a neat example for young scholars these days who are interested in international relations, interested in China. A lot of the questions and information that we are interested in are not those that are readily available. And that requires creative solutions. And that's how it got started.
So at the beginning, I'd like to know a little bit more about the history of China in the third world or the global south. So China initially was a recipient of development aid itself, right, from the Soviet Union in the 50s. And then probably starting from the Bandung Conference, China started to get involved in the third world as well and had projects such as the famous Tazara and stuff like that. So could you tell us a little bit about the early development aid efforts of the PRC and how its priorities and objectives evolved?
Yes, and it's very important, as you pointed out, to recognize that China's not a new donor. It's not a new lender either. It's been doing this for a long time. I think most people by this point recognize that and know that point, but it's basically a stylized fact that starts and ends there. And we say, yeah, China has been a donor for a long time. Now let's talk about what China's doing today. But there's a lot of interesting lessons, I think, that can be learned by looking at the history of China's aid and in other types of development capital. So as you suggested, it's very common among researchers to split the history of Chinese aid giving into different periods. And I think probably the most common way of doing that is to look at the early years of the PRC, during which, relations with the USSR were still good. And this is pre-Sino-Soviet split. China was giving out foreign aid in the 1950s. Its aims were much more limited than they are today, of course. A lot of this aid, maybe 90% of it, was going to countries in China's neighborhood, most of whom had, socialist political systems. So you can think of who that handful of countries are. And this was, in coordination with the USSR. Things start to get really interesting in the early 1960s and throughout that decade into the early 70s. China enters a period that I think a lot of people don't really appreciate just how remarkable China's aid was during this time. So after the Sino-Soviet split, and China enters a period of revolutionary foreign policy, its foreign aid is a big part of that story. So China's aid goes from primarily being used as a tool to help other communist countries in Asia as this global foreign policy tool. And China is now trying to be the leader of a global socialist movement. This is a really radical period in China's outward foreign relations. It's also a very diplomatically important period because China finds itself in a tug of war with Taiwan for diplomatic recognition, and that competition does not look like how it does today, where there's only a handful of countries that recognize Taiwan. This was a real tug of war at the time in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and foreign aid was a huge part of that struggle. So we see a big increase in China's aid to throughout Asia and throughout Africa and in other regions. The next cut point would probably be after the death of Mao, as we move into the Deng era eventually in the late 70s and early 80s. Chinese politics in general, China's foreign policy enters a period of recalibration, and there's a pretty I would say unanimous recognition that all of this aid from the revolutionary period, which, by the way, for much of that period, when we're talking about, say, the Cultural Revolution, late 60s, early 70s, China is still a very, very much a developing country. It's a poor country. Its GDP per capita is maybe a few $100s in some of these years. In foreign aid, if you look at the budgetary figures that are available, amounts up to 5, maybe 6% of the national budget. Now, just to give you a bit of perspective, that is way more than most countries spend on foreign aid today. Usually it's well under 1%, and it's still very controversial. So this is what I mean by that being a remarkable period. As we move into the Deng era, there's a recalibration, there's a scaling back. It doesn't mean there's no Chinese foreign aid, but the types of projects that China focuses on become smaller, sort of more economically viable. Again, I think this is a good example of how looking at the history can teach us lessons. The BRI today, I'm sure we'll get into this a bit later, is also in a period of recalibration. And this is not the first time that China has recalibrated its approach to development cooperation. And then I think the final big sort of shift is in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, where we get to this global infrastructure spree that includes the Belt and Road Initiative, but actually starts before it. And we see this interesting alignment between China's domestic economic goals and its desire to internationalize and go out, and a big increase in its development cooperation, and a much stronger commercial orientation of its development cooperation. So all of that's to say, yes, there have been very different periods of China's development cooperation, and that's often how the history of all this is looked at. I would also add, though, that we can look at it a different way. I actually think there are some interesting things that haven't changed so much. I think the one thing that has not changed at all is that if you want to understand China's foreign aid, you want to understand China's cooperation in the global south, you have to understand what's going on internally in China, both economically and politically. So I think oftentimes China's aid practices, its development finance, is a reflection of what China's priorities are at home. There's an important connection between the two. There are also other patterns and tendencies that, despite all of this really significant change in China's approach, have been rather constant. So whether we're talking about the 60s and 70s or today, China gives a lot of development finance to within the global south to really poor countries that have very low capacity and really need the money. That's encouraging, and that has been relatively consistent if you look at the data. China also has pretty much always used foreign aid as a geopolitical tool. Aid has always been strategic. And to be clear, that doesn't make China very unique. That's pretty much true for all donors and lenders, and China is no exception. And I think China's government has always appreciated the value strategically of aid for achieving both economic and political goals. One other thing that hasn't changed is the role of infrastructure in China's approach. So China now, one of the hallmarks of China's development cooperation is infrastructure. This is what we think of when we think of the Belt and Road Initiative. We think of these big mega projects, right? You mentioned, I think, Tazara earlier. That's a well-known example, but there are actually hundreds of other major infrastructure projects that China financed in the 20th century. I don't think a lot of people appreciate this, but going all the way back to that radical period of Chinese, revolutionary diplomacy and foreign policy, infrastructure is front and center in then, just as it is today. And it was a really important policy tool in China's struggle for diplomatic recognition as well. So yes, periods, but also not everything has changed.
Yeah, very interesting, very interesting. I think that last stage, starting from the turn of the millennium, that's where Chinese aid became more controversial, right? Probably more like towards the 2010s, where sort of international development organizations and also Western countries took notice and sometimes also took offense with the way that the Chinese were doing aid or lending, however you want to call it. This is a very big box to get into, obviously, but just in some broad sketches, what was it that made Chinese aid or Chinese lending controversial in this period?
That's an excellent question, and I have another long answer, but I think an important one. So I think this gets us to some of the narratives about what China's doing in the global south today, for example, the debt trap narrative. But again, there's an interesting context here that is sort of underlying a lot of this. So if we actually take a quick step back and we look, even before that period, before the 90s and the 2000s or even the 2010s, 20th century Chinese aid was also very controversial, certainly in the West. There were concerns about China spreading communist ideology in Africa, for example. China wasn't nearly as big of a player then as it is today. So it's a matter of scale, I suppose. But even when we think about some of these narratives in alarm about China's development finance today, you're right. I do think things picked up in the 2010s, certainly with the arrival of Xi Jinping, with the launch of the Belt and Road Initiative, with a more global and active China around the world. I think that is probably true. But if you look at the early 2000s as well, again, after the going out strategy really kicks into full gear and you start to see a lot of this infrastructure lending, a lot of these, really visible high profile projects start to show up in Asia and Africa and Latin America, for instance, in the Asia Pacific, Pacific Islands. You have other narratives that start to surface as well. This idea that China's a rogue donor, again, that's propping up dictators. It's building, useless buildings, as one Australian government official put it. It's doing things that help. It's extracting natural resources, of course, right? It is practicing neo-colonialism, right? There's all this baggage rhetorically that gets attached to Chinese development finance. So why is that? I'm not exactly sure, but I do think that this provides an interesting sort of perspective to think about, say the debt trap narrative, which is kind of the prevailing narrative about Chinese lending today. We've seen this process in international relations and international development where aid and lending from China, regardless of phase, is sort of consistently othered by some of the status quo actors in international development. Your question is about why that happens. I think it's a great question. I'm not sure we have a full answer. I mean, I think an obvious part of the answer, I think, is that this is about geopolitics and this is about a rising power, and this is simply a reflection of these structural dynamics, in the context of development. But it is very puzzling why some of these narratives end up sort of sticking and becoming very influential, whereas others do not, right? So I think there's a lot to unpack there as well.
Mm-hmm. And of course, if there's such a thing as development competition between great powers, then to some extent, with the closure of USAID, the United States has a little bit surrendered the field. Can you say that? So, or maybe not. I don't know. But would you say that this presents an opportunity for China to step into the vacuum and take over those projects or the need for development aid that is left by the closure of USAID?
Yeah, this is a point that has come up a lot this year. I think from a public relations standpoint, yes, there are low-hanging fruits in terms of soft power and continuing to look like a cooperative outside partner. These are things that China can do. Basically, don't do what the United States is doing. I think there are public relations, soft power gains to be had by reaffirming one's commitment to various global development initiatives. I would stop short of saying that China can substitute for what a lot of USAID has done over the years, though. I think donors and lenders in general develop comparative advantages. I think they develop reputations for being good and not good at different things. I think that's certainly the case when we talk about the United States and China. I don't think they have the same reputations, the same reputational comparative advantages, right? China now is seen as this very efficacious, fast, no strings attached infrastructure builder, a country that has the ability to get projects done of a reasonably high quality. The United States is seen as having its strengths in sort of the software of development, right? Health and education and democracy promotion, right? So I think a lot of what USAID was doing, one of the reasons why this is so jarring is because for much of the past, several decades, it really has been the leader in sort of the provision of soft sector global foreign aid. And so I don't think that's a gap that China or anyone else can just step in and fill. To take a step back, though, USAID is the the most newsworthy and the most sort of shocking example of this. But it's important to recognize we're seeing a retrenchment more generally, more globally, of development finance, right? As you probably know, a lot of European governments are starting to reduce their ODA commitments as well, right? This is a little bit more anecdotal, but I also get the sense that in China, there is a mixed appetite for continuing to provide major funding each year in outward aid and in big foreign infrastructure projects. I think there are a lot of questions about that. And I think this has always been a thing in international development. At the end of the day, concessional aid in particular, this is finance using taxpayer dollars, right? And so, again, even if it's less than 1% of the budget, if you look at the United States or Brazil or a number of European countries, foreign aid is really controversial because all of these countries, every country in the world has domestic priorities they need to tend to. So I think we're seeing a global sort of moment in which official sector development finance is somewhat in peril. At the very least, I think we're seeing reductions, and it's certainly time for developing countries to, and I think many of them have already been doing this, but to think beyond official sector aid and to think about development solutions beyond this traditional sort of north-south divide, global north, global south. Development finance flows into the global south, and this gets back to sort of China replacing the U.S. I think they do different things, and I don't think it's very likely that China or other players will just step in and immediately fill that aid gap that the U.S. is going to leave.
Yeah. I was just imagining from the point of view of like classic economics, there's sort of marginal utility curve where in the beginning the return political gain from one unit of investment is quite big, but then as you keep on going, like the marginal political benefit in terms of, I don't know, like UN voting or sort of political support for sort of a Chinese worldview is sort of decreasing over time. And maybe for China to step into that gap that USA has left, it would have to just go straight up continuously and not sort of. But maybe this is sort of.
Well, it's an interesting hypothesis. I think you struck on something there that should be added into this conversation, which is that I think there's a lot of disillusionment in some of these donor countries with the effectiveness of aid. I think this is getting at your point here. Certainly economically, I think there's a lot of skepticism about a couple of things. First of all, does aid even work? Can you administer aid in an effective way that actually helps developing countries achieve the outcomes they want? That is a canonical question in the political economy of aid, field. Second, are donors getting a return on their investment, and what exactly is that return? I think one of the reasons why the reaction to the USAID upheaval has been so strong is that even if you don't know the answer to that first question, a lot of the evidence suggests the answer to the second question is yes. Foreign aid does provide a lot of strategic benefits for donors and lenders, and so there's a reason why it's been an important U.S. foreign policy tool and a Chinese foreign policy tool for a very long time. Aid is really important as a soft power tool, right? There's the collective evidence shows basically that foreign aid, particularly again in the soft sectors, can be used to improve foreign attitudes towards the donor. You might say, well, why do I need soft power? Maybe I that's not a priority for me. Well, soft power also matters for hard power. Soft power can make it easier for your companies to do business abroad, right? It can make it more likely that a foreign government will be a government that is a friend of yours, right? So soft power objectively is valuable in international politics. And of course, foreign aid can also generate hard power, right? It can generate, as we were discussing, influence over governments as well. So this is a very sort of Machiavellian strategic way to think about all this, but this is how a lot of governments have thought about this over the years.
That's actually a very good segue into my next question, the role of soft power. And I want to single in a little bit on one country, the case of Laos, who was, of course, has a long history with both America and China. America was involved in the Vietnam War, or like sort of received a lot of the detrimental effects of the Vietnam War, and was also afterwards a recipient of USAID. So how specifically do you think in the case of Laos the cut will affect both American soft power but also the Chinese soft power that China has in the region?
Right. So I think with Laos there's a couple of moving pieces. First of all, starting on the Chinese side, Laos is a country with a very small GDP in Southeast Asia, and it has its rail project with China, which on the one hand I think is very popular, and it's very high profile, and it's captured a lot of the attention in terms of China's development finance presence in Laos. It's also a very expensive project for an economy like Laos. Now, connecting this to soft power is interesting because, I think there's a longstanding belief that, financing a lot of concessional development activities, really going into the grassroots and setting up health initiatives and education initiatives that are lasting and have a lasting impact, this can be important for soft power. On the other end of the spectrum, these really visible, high-profile infrastructure projects are also really interesting to think about from a soft power perspective. I think it depends on, whether you're a believer in soft power accumulating from direct interaction with a foreign aid project and trying to sort of touch and help as many people as you can, or if you're more of a believer in the idea that, a project that has so much publicity and is so well known, locally and nationally and even internationally, even if you have, millions of people in the country that aren't ever going to use this project directly, it enters into the psyche of how they think about, say, the relationship with China. So this gets really complicated. I think on the USAID, on the American side, this is one of the places where, the cuts from USAID are going to be felt very heavily because of some of the sort of institutional history that you talked about. So again, this is kind of a nice microcosm of what we were talking about. This is an opportunity, I think, for China to quote unquote step in and maybe take on a more prominent role as an external development provider. Again, it's also been in Laos for several decades now. Yet the things that China and the U.S. do in a country like Laos, at the very least, the things that they're most known for are different. So this is not a story of direct substitution. And of course, should note that, we're generalizing things here. China doesn't only build infrastructure. It has decades-old programs in health and education and agriculture, for example, as well. It's provided hundreds of what I call social infrastructure projects in these sectors as well. But I think the things that it's most known for when it comes to how people in Laos or other countries in the global south think about China, more often than not, I think a lot of attention is attracted to these big projects. So this gets us into an interesting intellectual space in terms of how we think about the accumulation of foreign public opinion and soft power. And this is an important ingredient for soft power. So you can make all the soft power investments that you want, but the payout depends almost completely on how the other side receives them and reacts to them. And I think this is something that has been an interesting lesson for China, over the first decade of the Belt and Road with all of these big projects.
Yeah. As something that I want to pull forward one question. You talked about the different comparative advantage and the different development niches or areas in which countries specialize. And you talked a lot about China specializing in certain types of development aid and the United States in others. So there's a certain degree of complementarity, you could say, theoretically, if it wasn't for other maybe political reason or whatever. But what do you think are both the areas and the potential where Chinese and Western development actors could work together? And maybe if you could also, I don't know if the European Union is even an actor in this space, but maybe you could also focus in a little bit towards the European Union. Are there areas where the European Union and China could complement, collaborate in the area of trade, of development aid?
Yeah, I think it's great you asked this question. This is a difficult time to even think in this direction, given the aerial level political dynamics between these big countries. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. So I appreciate you asking the question. From a macro level analysis, I think it's easy to come away very pessimistic in terms of forecasting, cooperation between China and some of these Western, quote unquote, traditional players in international development. I think on the ground, fortunately, reality is grounds for optimism. If you want to bring the European Union in and just sort of Europe in general, for a very long time, Chinese companies have successfully bid on and implemented lots of projects financed by European governments. So that's collaboration. There are new forms of cooperation between not necessarily the Chinese government, but different types of Chinese actors, public and private companies, NGOs, other actors within China's ecosystem that have participated in going global, that are partnering with Western actors overseas, be it international organizations, NGOs, or otherwise, or even Western governments. And you have a fair bit of, and this has been going on for a long time, co-financing between banks from China and Europe. So, it's very tempting to just sort of dismiss development cooperation, for example, even what we would call triangular cooperation, say a European country and a Chinese and China cooperating in a third country in the global south because of the geopolitical optics. But things are already happening, and that's what really matters for development, not these high-level narratives that don't actually do anything. So there's that. I do think there's some complementarity in terms of, the coexistence of these actors. As we've been talking about, I think China's comparative advantages are quite different than those of Western donors and lenders. And more importantly, it's not about what I think, but if you actually survey people in developing countries, they feel the same way. They see China as being good at A, B, and C, and in the West as being good at X, Y, and Z, essentially. So, yeah, in principle, there's a lot of complementarity. It's always been frustrating to me how, the global south in the field of international development has always been, colored by major power politics. Obviously, this was a big theme in the Cold War, and it's becoming a big theme again. It's very unfortunate because there are a lot of activities in the global south that can be purely developmental. They don't necessarily contribute to the national security of China or the United States or any European country, but because they are swept into these aerial level narratives, they are sort of precluded. I think that is very unfortunate, and again, this is why I appreciate you asking the question. It's important that we continue to think in that direction, even if it's difficult to do so in the current context. Yeah.
I think that's actually, since you mentioned what respondents say in developing countries about foreign aid and what their opinion is. So that's something I think where you research has focused on as well. So could you tell us a little bit about the finding of your research? Obviously, I guess you have done a million things, but something you find interesting for this conversation.
Absolutely. And you mean in the context of public opinion?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's go back for a minute to our discussion of some of these narratives about China. I think we need to close this loop. Yeah. So there's always been narratives that are swirling about the nature and the effects of China's aid and lending. A lot of these narratives, it's very easy to find negative narratives. You know where to look to find those. You can also find very positive narratives, and you can imagine where to find those as well. So a lot of my research has been about looking past those and basically trying to create data that allow us to figure out, which of these very strong claims is closer to the truth. When it comes to public opinion, I think there's been a couple of interesting takeaways from some of my work, particularly in Southeast Asia in the last couple of years. The first one is that, I think it's very tempting to think of the Belt and Road Initiative and China as, again, this increasingly powerful actor that is sort of a behemoth in all these developing countries and is really exercising its will in these places. But when it comes to public opinion and what Xi Jinping would call telling China's story well, right? 讲好中国故事, right? This has been a really difficult diplomatic challenge for China. There are a lot of narratives that I think China's government sees as very unfair and inaccurate. The debt trap is, again, a good example. So the idea of the debt trap, right, is that not only is China financing this infrastructure in developing countries through large loans that will put developing countries into unsustainable debt burdens, it's actually doing it on purpose because it wants these countries to default so that Chinese actors can seize strategic assets or otherwise, acquire strategic benefits. Academics have consistently debunked this narrative. We don't have to get into that because there's been so much work on it already. But I think what's more important is the fact that this narrative has had a lot of staying power, and that's created a big public relations challenge for China's government in a lot of these countries. I've been doing a lot of work in Indonesia, for instance. So the first lesson is that just providing all this capital, it's actually a very risky sort of diplomatic strategy because once these projects are in the ground and once things start, actually you lose a lot of control over your ability to control the narrative, even if you are a really powerful and sophisticated country and government like China. There are real limitations to shaping the narrative. Relatedly, however, we've also noticed that some of the ways in which a lot of people were thinking about public opinion towards China or towards the U.S. or towards USAID in these countries was probably a little bit too simple. The traditional way of thinking about this was more aid leads to more favorable opinions, and I think it's a much less linear process than that. What we've seen in a number of countries with big infrastructure projects from China is a more nuanced, more complicated picture where for the average Indonesian, for example, it's very plausible that the same person can be very concerned about debt to China and they can feel like their country owes too much to foreign powers, including China, and that this is very worrisome. They can also be very excited about and even supportive of big Chinese finance projects. For example, the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail. I've been doing some surveys on this project. So I think people's perspectives are a lot more sophisticated than we initially gave them credit for. And, that has to be factored in as well. I think one of the advantages of slowly moving away from this traditional framework of aid from donors to recipient countries is we think more about people in host countries where all of this action actually happens. And so, I think this example of public opinion is kind of a reflection of this broader trend.
To conclude, I'd like to look a little bit into the future, into the glass ball, if you want. It's always very difficult, but sort of what your feel is, where Chinese aid is, in which direction it is developing. Has China sort of shot the big guns, the big ammunition with the early, well, let's say with the first decade of the Belt and Road? Now there's less of big infrastructure projects? Are we seeing more small and beautiful? Are we seeing more green finance? Where do you think, or more PPP maybe, I don't know. Where do you think Chinese aid is going to develop, let's say, over the next decade, let's say over the 2020s?
Right. Well, we'll see if we look back on today in a few years if this is another shift in China's approach. It could be. So just now, I was making the point that the debt trap is this kind of problematic framing of Chinese lending. However, that doesn't mean that Chinese lending is without problems. It simply means the framing is problematic, and it's actually unproductive because there are real issues, I think, with a lot of Chinese loans that others have pointed out. And all the discussion of the debt trap, I actually think, distracts attention from some of these other issues that we should be talking about. So it's become, and I think the best evidence of this is that, indeed, as you suggest, as we move into this, the next decade of the Belt and Road, which is a signature Xi Jinping kind of foreign policy initiative, we're seeing very public signals that, the BRI is changing, right? Peak BRI, the way we used to think about BRI being these, massive physical infrastructure projects financed through China Exim Bank and China Development Bank, peak BRI is definitely in the rearview mirror. That doesn't mean the end of Chinese global infrastructure. I think there will still be plenty of big infrastructure projects. There will be, as you suggest, more new forms of infrastructure as well, big digital infrastructure projects, including those included in the Digital Silk Road, right? A push towards greener infrastructure. All of that, I think, is happening. But I think this recalibration is also a reflection of a couple of things. One, China's government has also realized that, look, the Belt and Road has been executed for a decade. And even before that, again, there was another decade or so of big ticket infrastructure financing. So China has a couple of decades of information and experience to reflect on. And the BRI that is now being touted in, official statements from China's government is one that is going to be more transparent and inclusive and greener, right? More participatory. These are absolutely some of the problems that have come up along the BRI over the past 10 years. These are some of the sources of the local backlash we've seen in some cases. So, I think the BRI, it's been a mixed bag. There's been some real successes. I think China has really, no pun intended, cemented its reputation as the game in town for delivering on tangible development projects. But there's clearly a lot of room for improvement and try to finance more sustainable infrastructure. So I think we're moving into sort of a hybrid state where some of these comparative advantages that China has built up, I don't think there's much of a logic to just abandon them. But I think the peak BRI was probably not sustainable. Certainly with again, the fact that a lot of this is also a reflection of China's own domestic circumstances as well. And I think there's just a lot of room for learning. We're also seeing diversification of China's approach. So beyond this older model of state finance or state-backed finance through policy banks and executed through Chinese state-owned enterprises as contractors, we're seeing new actors enter the fray. We're seeing old actors like Chinese companies take on and assume new roles in terms of getting more equity in projects, financing projects, not only building them. We're seeing new types of partnerships being formed. So I think it's a bit of a hybrid situation where various BRI actors are trying out different things with the overarching goals of trying to make the BRI more sustainable.
Mm-hmm. So I think this is definitely a field that keeps on evolving, and it's definitely still very exciting. All the changes that are happening in the area of Chinese development and development aid in general, and even more so development, the rise of the global south and so on. So this is definitely a space that we need to keep watching. I'm so happy we could have this conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining on the European Guanxi podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.